just look at,
Sorry.
you just look at one part, like one small part, and really getting close to it. And what I have found is very often, by looking at one small part, you actually get a good sense of the whole. Cervantes said this in Don Quixote, by a single thread, you can know the whole skein. By a single shard, you can know the whole piece of pottery. So I think what's really interesting is when we look at each gospel's telling of the resurrection, you actually get a really good sense of what each of the gospels, how they're presenting Jesus, how they're connecting with their audience, and how the resurrection really is the embodiment of everything that they're trying to tell you about what happened in this early Christian community and why it matters, and why it should matter to us. So, does anybody remember, and I know Paul hates my pop quizzes, does anybody remember what your ministers preached on Easter morning? Which text they preached out of?
Yeah, I was at two, so they were different.
Oh,
The Easter Vigil, she preached on Mark's story, on the one that ends 20.
okay. I'm glad that you mentioned that, and you got lots of points, treasure in heaven for going to 2 Easter services, especially if you really want.
The second one was John.
Oh, you got the bookends.
Yeah, and because we've been doing a lot with Mary Magdalene too, and so all through Holy Week, so.
Yeah. Awesome.
That brought.
So what's interesting is Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. And Mark is also the Gospel that Luke and Matthew base their story on. Now they do some things to it, and they expand and they edit and they add their own flourishes, but it's essentially the same story. John is the maverick gospel. He just does his own thing. Like I told people, he's an Enneagram 4. He has to be different. It's okay. My husband's one too, so I know how to put up with John. But what's very interesting, and so John is the latest gospel. So what you got that morning was the first gospel narrative and the last one. And it's, I think, really important to, what I'm going to tell you right now is forget everything that John tells you. Okay, just put it out of your head. You're like, John who? I don't know anything about this guy, John. I don't know anything about a gospel he wrote. We're going to look at Mark's gospel telling of the resurrection. And I don't want you to read anything else into it. Be like, well, where's the, nope, just what's here. And here's what I think is interesting. The Gospels weren't written until about 30, 40, and 50 years after Jesus' time on earth. Paul's letters are much earlier. And Paul knows about a resurrection. He says this guy Jesus was crucified and God raised him from the dead. But Paul doesn't seem to know anything about an Easter narrative like what we have. He doesn't talk about angels or an empty tomb or women going. All he says is God raised him from the dead. That's it. And this early church, for apparently decades, that's all they had.
Oh.
All they knew is that someone died the most horrible, shameful death, and God raised that person from the dead. Now, here's the beauty. That was enough. No. They didn't have all these stories, but what they did have, the knowledge of that was enough. Now, what's interesting is the Gospels, when they started to be written, was after Jerusalem had been decimated and the temple been destroyed. And Jews, which Christians were part of at that time, were ejected from the Holy Land and not allowed within like a certain radius of Jerusalem. And so what I find really interesting is, notice when we start getting narratives about the gospel, Jesus, the events of the crucifixion, the resurrection, it happens after a time of loss, and people need to connect with this in a new and different way. And that's when the Christian church starts to write the stories. Okay, before we had letters of, all right, are we holding it together? Are we keeping it together? Are we going to make it to the end of the year? And everyone thinks Jesus is coming back right away. Well, now when we get to the narratives, the church has an idea that it might not be today. In fact, it might not even be tomorrow. And so that's what prompts these stories to be written. Now, I'm not saying that they're not true, but they are all different. And they're all being told for a different reason. And so I think when we start looking at these stories, we're going to see what some of those reasons are. And I think that for us, I think we can really identify with this audience, right? We're also not in that first generation Christian eyewitnesses. We didn't touch Jesus's clothes, right? And we need to connect with this through a story in order to feel like we're part of it. And so what I think is interesting is that Mark's audience and Luke's audience, we have a lot in common with. And so I think that we can be especially thankful for what they left us, considering that even though it's a long time afterwards, we're in a really similar condition. Jesus might not come back right away, but this story is no less real and present for us and no less changing our world than if he was. So, I appreciate that you said they talked about Mark's story with the bizarre ending. You can totally see Mark has a strange resurrection story. And so, Carmi, I'm so glad you preached out of it. So many people are like, oh, I don't want to preach out of Mark's stuff. Mark's got a great resurrection story. So here it is. It's 8 verses. That's it. 8 verses. And we're just going to read it all through. And I want you to listen and pick out what seems odd to you. Okay, I mean, besides the fact that someone was dead and now everyone says that, that's pretty crazy. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So how the heck did anybody ever know what? Really? Pam, come on, have you ever met a group of women that just decided they weren't going to tell anybody? Yeah, right. All right, so what did you hear? What seems odd, or are you thinking, I think we should talk about that? What questions do you have? Yeah.
So was it a thing for women to go anoint people after they're dead? I don't know. Was that like what women did to dead people after a couple of days?
Well, I don't know if it was a couple of days, but remember, this is the first day of the week. So they had to go home for the Sabbath, and he's been brutally murdered. And so they couldn't get near that on a Sabbath day. And yeah, like anointing the body, preparing it for burial was something you did, but I think.
Don't they do that before they bury him?
Well, I feel like the circumstances under which he died were a little strange. Yeah.
So the text says they brought spices. Was that a sort of embalming that they did in those days?
And a way of showing care. You know, that you would, I mean, and we even still do this. People will still wash the body, even though you're like, why does it need to be clean? But we still do this. It's a way of showing love and care and honor. And it's one of, I think, the most beautiful things we do as human beings, that we spend so much time and attention on someone after they've passed. And that this is an ancient practice that you would use very expensive ointments and perfumes on someone who's no longer alive. Like that's a lavish type of love. which I think is beautiful. Yeah.
I've always been curious, because I don't know the need of Gospels, but Mark certainly does. I talk about who rolled the stone back, and then who is this person in the white robe?
Okay. First of all, you're right. The stone's already rolled away in Mark's gospel, and it never tells us who rolled it away.
Yeah.
Right.
And it doesn't really tell you, it just says a man dressed in a white robe.
A young
It's-
man dressed in a white robe. Yes, we will talk about that. That does matter. That matters. What else?
I was always assumed it was, he was an angel and he's the one that rolled the stone away. An angel presumably would have whatever powers necessary to accomplish the mission. They've got to get the tomb open so that the fact that Jesus has been raised is fully evident.
But what's funny is he doesn't say any of this.
Yes, right.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, if we're just working with what the text says, you're right. We never get an answer, and anything we might make is an assumption.
Yeah,
Okay, good. What else?
and who was sitting in
Yeah,
the tomb?
and who's the guy in the tomb?
And why the right side?
And why the right
Very
side?
specific.
Yeah. And what's also very interesting is okay, well, I totally just blanked. I'm sure there was something interesting, but I don't remember. Yeah.
Sorry, right there. I noticed too, now I realize we're not supposed to compare, but I think in the other gospels it's dark. And now it's early, but the sun's come up.
Dang, okay, first of all, it's
I know I'm not supposed to.
no, but you're right. All three of the synoptics actually have it being light. It's only John's gospel that it's still dark. And that means something. And you'll have to wait until we talk about John to figure out what it is. Or just read John over and over.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I didn't get this until the way you read it. You said, go tell his disciples and Peter.
Yeah.
Isn't Peter one of the disciples?
Yeah.
I was questioning. I always focus whenever the name Peter shows up. Usually in some context of Peter getting something wrong and so forth, but in this case, I was exactly the question Sarah was going
Okay, yeah.
Well, I find interesting the last line, starts with so and not but. So I mean, they encounter the young man, he says, don't be alarmed, all of this, trust me, and it's like, so they went out and fled. Not, but they went out, or like they
Yeah.
were, almost like it's a continuation, like it's like expected or anticipated that they would be fearful. Which, even though it seems like they shouldn't be, like, it seems like a contradiction.
That is fantastic, and it is a continuation.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that. That's a fantastic question. Also, what's really funny is in Greek, this is a triple negative. Which you can do in Greek, you can't do in English very well, because they say nothing to nobody, never. And all it does is really emphasize they never talked about this, which I find really interesting. You guys are basically, well, you can go home now, yeah.
They never encountered Jesus.
And there's no Jesus. Yeah, that is a fantastic observation, and that is what Mark has solely, is a lack of a risen Jesus. We don't see. Yeah.
But I will say that, one might argue, or maybe I read somewhere, just like I get my gospels all mixed up, but the one where Mary is there and doesn't recognize Jesus.
That's John.
John, yeah.
I told you, just don't get about John.
Right, but it doesn't identify this young man dressed in a white robe. Could that be Jesus himself, and he's just not recognized?
No.
Oh.
I like it.
No. Then how did this young man know it was Jesus of Nazareth?
That's a great question. All right. Let's see, all right, who was, the first question was, why do they go anoint Jesus's body? Was that the first question, I think? Like, or was this an actual thing? All right, so you guys like totally, like figured it out ahead of time. So it's very interesting that they go to anoint him. Because, and only in Mark do we get this story told this way. Back in Mark 14, Jesus is at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, which, how do you get a nickname like that, I wonder? As he sat at the table, a woman came in with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard and broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. And Jesus said, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. That is huge. Because just like you guys said, was this a thing that you would anoint a dead body? Yes. It is not a thing that you anoint a living body for death. But it's almost as if, well, and Jesus keeps saying the Son of Man must undergo these things and be killed and then be raised. Jesus is basically saying, I have to be anointed beforehand because there won't be time to anoint my dead body afterwards. So it's very interesting that we have this arrangement where Jesus is anointed beforehand. He is preparing for his death. The community is preparing for his death before he even gets there. And so when we come to the resurrection and the women come to anoint his body, what does that tell us? If they're like, well, we better go anoint him. They haven't put these things together yet, right? That they're still operating under the assumption that Jesus has died and so therefore is dead, which is normally a really good assumption to make. If someone has died, you can usually assume that they are dead. But what's interesting is that this is the most faithful of Jesus's followers. And even they did not get it. Now, I think that's good news for you and me. If those are Jesus's most faithful and they still did not understand, and even after seeing the empty tomb run away in fear and terror, we're okay. Who's the young man? All right. This is a very interesting word that Mark only uses twice. The word is neoniskos, and it means young man. Now, could it be an angel? No. Because Mark has a word for angel, angelos. And Mark uses that word back when Jesus is in the wilderness and the angels come and wait on him. And Mark writes in a very basic Greek, okay? He's not using a whole lot of flourishes. He's not terribly literary in that sense of style. Now, I think he's very literary in the way he uses motifs and the way he uses tropes. But as far as his writing goes, it's very straightforward. This is why a lot of people, when they learn to read Greek, Mark is the first gospel, because it's just easy to read. So if he meant angel, I kind of think he would have just said angel. I don't think he would have been terribly cagey about that. But I think what's interesting is, we know it's a young man in a white robe on the right side of the tomb. The only other time that Mark uses this word neoniskos, a certain young man was following Jesus wearing nothing but a linen cloth. Now, this is in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arrested. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran off naked. Why do you not see this in children's coloring pages? Like, why is this? I swear you will get kids to pay attention to the Bible more if you taught these kind of passages. Why do we not teach this passage? So what's interesting, he's also in a white linen cloth. But what happens? He's separated from that cloth, right? He runs off exposed. He deserts, he leaves. So what's very interesting, we won't talk about that guy. When we look at ancient first century Christian Baptist practices, the baptism candidate would always enter on the left side, be baptized, and would exit on the right and be given a white robe. So who is the young man? He's a baptized believer. Someone who has undergone baptism, someone who has been taught and instructed by the church, who knows this story. And he's the one telling the women, he's not here. This place of death is not where he resides. And so what's very interesting is to a first century Christian reading Mark's gospel, if you heard someone sitting on the right side in a white robe, you're like, that's clearly someone who's just been baptized. And saying the line, he is not here, he has been raised, is more than likely part of a first century creedal statement. Jesus is not in the tomb, Jesus has been raised. And so what's interesting is this young man, although I wouldn't say that he's an angel like that we think in the sense of like sparkly, terrifying. What I do think is the word angel means what? Messenger. He is an angel of sorts. He announces this news. He gives them the message. Oh, you haven't heard? Jesus isn't here. He's been raised. And so this is what any baptized Christian, any person who has decided to follow Jesus, this is the message that they proclaim. So again, I think we have a whole lot in common with some of the people in the story. Yes, Paul?
Does the young man sort of symbolize the future church, the future baptized body?
Or just the present church at the time? Because this is still pretty young, and you would only have baptism on Easter. You would only have it when you celebrated the Easter service, and that's why Lent was a period of preparation for baptism in the early church. You know, you would have these 40 days of fasting and prayer, and you've been catechized. You know, you've been taught. You have all the stuff that you need to know, basically. As if you could ever get all of that in 40 days or a lifetime. But anyway, so that's what we're looking at here is, yes, a picture of maybe not just any believer, but maybe the picture of all believers, that this young man sitting there epitomizes the church. That's a great way to think. I had not thought about it like that. But I like that thought. And I think Mark would probably be on board with that. So then the other question is, why did the women run away? And why does it say so they ran away, as if that just makes sense? Like, well, clearly he tells them everything is fine and it's going to be great and they'll get to see Jesus again. So of course they run away and they don't tell anybody about it like they've been told to. Well, the problem is everybody in Mark's gospel deserts Jesus. And this is a motif that Mark uses. A lot of scholars say that Mark is really just a passion narrative with a long introduction. Jesus is kind of cranky in Mark's gospel and always alone and kind of rough. And he ends up being left by everybody. So it's only in Mark's gospel we get this sense that Jesus's family deserts him. They think he's crazy. And they come and try to take him home before he makes a spectacle of himself as a wandering homeless prophet. This is very different from the story we get in Luke, where his parents have an idea of the fact that he's this son of God. In Mark, we don't get that. Mark doesn't know about that. Judas leaves Jesus. And then, like as we saw with the naked man and all the rest of the disciples leave Jesus. It also talks about when he's in his trial that the religious authorities abandon their actual role in the law. They actually don't act with justice, meaning the religious authorities also abandon Jesus to the Romans. The Passover crowd, God. In Mark's gospel, Jesus never says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. All he says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's it. That's that bare bones, rough, alone Jesus, completely by himself. And so if God has forsaken you, it's only a matter of time before the people who have followed Jesus the closest, the women make it the longest. Like, go women. Like they stick it out as long as they can and longer than anybody else. But even they, at the end, if we're looking at this as some kind of a drama or a play, they also exit stage left.
But the young man in the white robe tell them to go. He tells them to go.
Yeah, I tell my kids all kinds of things. And that doesn't mean they do it.
That's the reason for them to go.
Oh, sure it is.
Yeah.
But so there's a real problem here, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
The real problem is, how does anybody know about this?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
You know, excuse me, it always seemed to me that they left in a hurry. They wanted to go to their support group and talk to them, and he didn't. To me, what the man was saying, don't blab to everybody you know, go speak to the people that know and get it. So I think it's, that they were in a hurry, and they went to the people they knew that would help them understand this.
But it said they told nothing to nobody. They told nothing to nobody ever.
What I always thought was just until they got to their help.
If we're going on what we have in the text, unfortunately, we don't get that kind of closure, which is interesting, because you're right, they've been instructed. And we know that somebody tells something or we wouldn't know about it. I mean, like, come on. Like, it's always like, I always think that this is hilarious when I'm arguing with people who are just insistent that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. I'm like, see, you are arguing he was alive at creation and he wrote about his own funeral afterwards. And I'm like, there are so many problems with this. And again, like this, well, clearly somebody said something. But again, if we're looking at this as a narrative, not a historical report, because again, who the heck is writing this down if nobody says anything? This is being crafted so we understand something about the whole rest of the gospel. Now, what's interesting is Mark has this motif that he uses. Remember, I said he is very literary, and it's called the secrecy motif. Every time somebody identifies Jesus as the Son of God, Jesus tells them to shut up. Don't tell anybody. Well, now, go tell people, and nobody does. I swear, Jesus identifies with every mother everywhere. Now that I want you to do something, now you don't want to do it. But it's an inverse of that motif, is that we've been waiting. We've been waiting for this message to get out, because as the reader, you knew who Jesus was, because at the beginning, it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We knew right away. Okay. And so we're waiting, and you can feel this tension building. All right. Can somebody please just say he's the Son of God? Well, somebody does finally say he's the Son of God, and they're not told to be quiet. Does anybody know who it is? The only person? The centurion. Jesus is on the cross and he dies, and he says, this was God's son. Jesus wanted to make sure that nobody confused anything else with him being the Son of God other than dying on a cross. It was absolutely important. He can't be the Son of God because he teaches amazing things. He can't be the Son of God because he heals people. He can't be the Son of God because he exorcises demons. The only thing that you can identify him truly as divine is his willingness to die a grisly, brutal death alone. That's it. And so we've been waiting, and now we know so he's alive? All right, somebody can finally say something, and then they run away and they don't tell anything. Can you feel like we're frustrated?
Yeah.
We're like, what? Does nobody understand what is supposed to happen now? Well, and that's what happens when Mark does what Mark does and leaves the God. And I realize y'all probably can't read Greek. I promise that this will be translated. Do you see this last word here that's in this bold?
Yeah, or whatever.
That's the word for, or because.
Oh.
Mark ends in the middle of a sentence.
He just leaves us hanging.
Yeah, that's exactly what he does. I know, if we ever catch him in heaven, right? Out in the street, you know.
Yeah, this is hard because we've heard the story over the years. Different. Huh?
Yeah, so they said nothing, never to no one. They were afraid because, or even so.
Which,
So he leaves off in the very middle of a sentence.
Yeah.
Would you
they're all-
translate
they're all
that one?
afraid they're gonna have the same thing happen to
Yeah.
them.
Okay. And, or then, they said, nothing, never, to no one. They were afraid, for,
Okay.
or because, so. He leaves in the middle of a sentence. And I think he does this on purpose. The story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, trailing off in mid-sentence. After all, no one in the story who has been with Jesus is willing to carry the message and continue his mission. Is there anyone who might be a faithful disciple? Is there anyone?
No one,
Who's the one left?
Mary Magdalene?
No, she'd gone. Mary Magdalene left with all the other women
Oh, okay.
and said nothing
No one,
to no one,
ever.
ever. Throughout the story, there has been one, a non-participant observer who has been with Jesus in every scene. Who is it? Is you.
Oh, it's us.
Now the reader stands at the brink of the incomplete narrative in which everyone else has failed. And with terrible restraint, the narrator breaks off the story and leaves the readers who may have thought the story was about somebody else with a decision to make. So if you're so frustrated that nobody is telling everybody that Jesus, the crucified, the most humiliated, the lowest, that's the one God has chosen to raise from the dead. If you're so frustrated, go tell someone.
Yeah.
Continue the story. The story wasn't over. That's why. And what's really interesting is if you notice that very first verse is, it says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Son of God. And I think what Mark meant was this whole story is just the beginning of the gospel. He didn't mean that verse. He meant the whole shebang. All of this is just the beginning. Guess what you get to do? Finish it.
Yeah, you told us that before Christmas.
I'm so glad that, see, you should tell my kids that some people actually really like to listen to what I say. Right? So why don't we see Jesus? That was the other question. Why is there no Jesus? Well, and this is from Donald Jewell, one of my favorite scholars on Mark's gospel. He says this: Mark's gospel forbids precisely that closure. There's no stone at the mouth of the tomb. Jesus is out and on the loose, on the same side of the door as the women and the readers. The curtain, the doors in Mark's gospel are emphatically open. The curtain of the temple has been rent asunder. The stone is rolled back from the tomb, and God is no longer safely behind the curtain. What does it mean that Mark writes a very dangerous resurrection narrative? How is this story dangerous?
Dangerous. Well,
it's
we've never been told
It's
to
kind
make the
of,
specific thing we gotta do to stay safe.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think it's dangerous to the powers that want everything under control.
Yeah, because this means everything has gotten out of control.
Well, one of the powers that's trying to control the Romans. And you mentioned that this is written after the temple had been destroyed. And according to one of the books I got out of the library here on the historical Jesus, the Romans crucified 5,000 Jews and on one day in the process of, sacking Jerusalem. So these people have great reason to be afraid that someone is going to capture them and destroy them.
Oh, for sure. And that by capturing them and destroying them, they have the final authority. They have the final say. And this story says, on the contrary, God is the one with the final say. And so what if they've just decimated Jerusalem? What if the temple is in ruins? We have a God that raises people from the dead. So
God could do anything.
And he's not safely, he doesn't have to be behind the curtain's gone,
yeah,
because the temple's gone.
yeah,
And so that doesn't matter, because God's not, the stone has been rolled. The stone has been rolled away for Jerusalem
mhm,
in the Baptist Lord, right? Except that's okay, because God still comes, it's not in there.
and it's also an unsafe thing for the rest of us. If Jesus is out and we don't know exactly where he is, and we don't know, we don't know what form he's taken now that he's raised from the dead, he could encounter us anywhere.
Yeah, this is a God who is not of our own making.
Yeah.
So God is no longer safely behind.
And God has already proven by raising the crucified one from the dead, God has already proven that the people and things and structures that the world has in place not only aren't really anything for a God this big, but God's not particularly pleased with them either, which means all of these disciples might go about their lives and encounter Jesus somewhere that might be rather inconvenient. Or encountering Jesus somewhere where you're asked to do something really hard. Or to love people that crucified you, betrayed you. This is a really hard and dangerous ending for a gospel, because it means we don't know what it looks like. You can't have a formula. Okay, there's no Romans road here, because that's not what the Romans road means anymore. There's no checklist. There's nothing that we know. There's nothing we can even assume. We are now in a completely different time where all the rules have changed. And we've got to pivot really quickly and adapt really quickly. And we have to, if we want to be part of this resurrected community, we have to be willing to die the same death. Because this is what pleases God. God raised Jesus from the dead because this is actually what pleases God. And so now, where are we going to find Jesus? We don't know.
Yeah.
And that's scary.
And
He might look like crazy people.
that's kind of like where we are now.
That's exactly where we are now. And it's exactly it. Like I said, folks, this isn't a story about them back then. This is just as much a story of us right now. And just like them, we are also not part of that first century. We didn't get to see Jesus in the flesh. We didn't look in his eyes. And yet this story is meant very much for us. Jesus is somewhere out there. He's on the loose. And here's what I love about Jesus being on the loose. Did you know that the symbol for Mark's gospel is a lion?
Knew that.
So think about Jesus as this lion. Well, aren't we glad God raised that from the dead and it's out there on the loose somewhere? It might cause a lot of damage. It might actually destroy a lot of things. It might even kill some things. Some things might have to die if you have a lion running around on the loose. You know, don't let your pet dog out. But here's what I love is, and if any of you have read C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Jesus is also personified by a lion, Aslan. And I love that this is one of the things that they say about him. Is he is a lion? The lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. And this is what Mark is asking the readers to make peace with. Can you make peace with the fact that Jesus is good and not safe?
Mm-hmm.
And that life with Jesus can be good but not safe. you risk giving up your rights, the way you would rather have things, your own prejudices, your right to judge and decide who's in and who's out, your comfort. But it's good. It's just really risky. And this, I think, is the message that's so necessary for us, because we've had 2,000 years for this message to mellow. Okay, the cross doesn't offend anybody anymore. We don't realize how offensive that is. We don't realize how total that is. And so for us, I think that having to be reminded, this is risky. And I've heard so many testimonies, because I'm Baptist, that's what we do. And every testimony that I heard so often was, well, before Jesus, my life was crazy and a mess. That's why we call it working on your testimony when you're just having fun sinning. But then once I came to Jesus, man, my credit score got better, and I got my life in order, and I have a steady job, and I got a house, and now I live this very, rational, safe, normal life. And I'm like, well, that's good. I mean, I'm glad if you're no longer addicted to heroin or something, but I'm not sure that that's the same thing that Mark's talking about. I'm not sure that that's what he means by following Jesus, that the fact that your life now has no risk involved. I think, on the contrary, Mark imagines a great deal of risk, especially for his community. Just because they've been pushed out of Jerusalem doesn't mean they're safe. Jews are being expelled out of Rome by the Emperor Claudius. And remember, during that time, Christians and Jews, there was no difference. Christians were just another type of Jew. They were particularly irritating. So you're not safe. And so if we think being a Christian and following Jesus somehow makes us safe, we have to reread the ending of this story and remember, oh, it doesn't. By choosing to do this, I have just thrown my life away. And that's good. All right, any questions?
Could we come back next week and just do this one again?
Can you imagine 8 verses being so powerful? Proof that we don't have to talk all the time. Those 8 verses matter so much. And of course, the longer we get into the gospel narratives, because after Mark, we get Luke and Matthew writing about the same time. They both have longer stories. And by the time we get to John, this resurrection story is like freaking 2 chapters. Like, it's like a fish story that keeps growing and getting bigger and bigger. And like, they keep adding stuff to it. And I'm like, but this 8 verses,
This is the basics.
it's enough. This is enough.
I had one question because I heard somewhere
That is power.
that they really thought that the person who disrobed, left his garment, was Mark.
I have heard that too. And I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like, and Mark gives us all these little asides where he'll say like, and even to this day. And so we know that not only is he writing stories that either he remembers or that people have told him and been like, these are followers of Jesus, take the story. But it seems like he's also adding his own personal commentary on how he's come to understand it. I wouldn't be surprised if he did something like that, but maybe it's also that the young man in the white robe and the young man in the other white robe are the same. And maybe all of us have betrayed Jesus and run away when it got too dangerous. And maybe all of us still find another chance at the empty tomb. And I think that's why he says, go tell his disciples and Peter.
Yeah.
Making sure that the one who it mattered the most to, because he said, I will never leave you. I don't care what we have to go through. Well, he does. But he was the one who made the biggest show saying he would. And so it's that one, the one that fell the furthest is the one that our messenger at the tomb says, make sure that one knows that Jesus wants to see him and wants him to be part of this group that comes to meet him when he shows up in Gallup. And I think that there's a lot of good news in that, because it means right here in this gospel narrative, there is already this understanding, oh, by the way, not only is this not safe and it's good, but you'll fail. You won't get this right all the time, and that's okay. Some days you're the young man running away naked and exposed. And then some days you're actually telling people and proclaiming, did you know that there's such a thing as a crucified one raised from the dead? And that this is somehow expected, but also okay. I mean, you want to be more clothed than not clothed, but so. You guys, great questions. Like, it was like basically like you did the outline before I even got here. So thank you for your amazingly good work and time and attention. And next week, we will do Matthew's gospel.
Yeah, I can't wait.
That was wonderful. I think you've just given us all so much to think about. It's gonna take a week. No, that's Mark.
Mark did that.
Thank you. Thank you and Mark for working together to bring this to us today. And yeah, come back next week, Matthew. And I will send the PowerPoint to Paul. So I know that there's like a lot of you know, verses and stuff. So if you guys need it, you're welcome to use it, you know, if you want to review or stuff before next week. Thank you so much.